Reteach, podcast for teachers seeking fresh viewpoints, deeper subject knowledge, and diverse thinking.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Reteach History podcast. I'm delighted to have you on board this afternoon because we've got a bumper edition with not one, not two, but three guests this afternoon. So wherever you are in the world, if you're in the United Kingdom, spring might have sprung, kind of. Globally, maybe something different. I was speaking to a former colleague this morning, and she's contending with 36-degree heat in Adelaide. So we are delighted that we have a global audience for the Reteach podcast, and we love your feedback, and we love to hear how things have been useful for you generally and specifically when it comes to history teaching. So this idea of thinking about differences, it's certainly not 36 degrees in Carlisle, believe you me, this afternoon. This idea of difference is something that's really important in history teaching. Being inclusive and representative, as you know, is something that we've tried to do through all of the episodes of the podcast. And this afternoon is no exception, because we're going to be looking today at the Gypsy Roma traveller community. And I'm absolutely thrilled to tell you that we have a member of the community, Violet Cannon, who is the CEO of the York Travellers Trust. So we're going to hear from Violet shortly. Welcome, Violet.
Good afternoon.
Lovely to have you here. We also have two, experienced, esteemed, expert history teachers, Helen Snelson and Rich Kerridge. And I'll tell you something, they are indefatigable when it comes to quality history teaching. If you've not come across them, go to their sessions, read what they've written. They are really, really spot on, at the chalk face, pragmatic, realistic, and they've been in the game a long time. They've written together for the Teaching History magazine on this topic of Gypsy Roma Traveller, Teaching History 188, September 2022. And on the back of that, Helen has written a chapter for the What is History Teaching Now book, edited by Alex Fairlam and Rachel Ball. So they're two really good starting points if you want to do some reading on this topic. So Helen, first of all, Helen has taught history in secondary schools in Yorkshire for 20 years. She now spends most of her time training history teachers with the University of York, PGCE. She's chair of the HA Secondary Committee. My goodness, that's a tough job, believe you me. And a Euro Clio ambassador. She supports Teacher CPD, including coordinating the One Big History Department blog. Get involved with that if you haven't done. And the York Clio site, plus webinars and conference presentation. She's a textbook and other resource writer. She's basically all things to all people when it comes to history teaching. Helen, we're delighted you've been able to join us this afternoon.
It's great to be here, Carmel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, Richard, what can we say? Rich Kerridge, I suppose he's seen it all from both sides now, to coin a phrase, because he's joined Cambridge International Assessment in September 2019 and OCR in October 2022. Prior to joining OCR, he taught history for 17 years and was a deputy head of sixth form, head of humanities, SSAT, lead practitioner, as well as writing and contributing to textbooks and exam board resources. He has presented at the Historical Association and the Schools History Project annual conferences and for keynote education. Richard is very proud to be an honorary fellow of the Historical Association, and rightly so. And he enjoys being surrounded by his family, friends, and, you might hear them this afternoon, his two dogs. Welcome, Rich.
Hi, thanks, Carmel. Thanks for inviting me.
Delighted that you can be here. Okay, so Gypsy Roma Traveller. Wow. Now, I've had the absolute pleasure and delight of teaching students from the Gypsy Roma Traveller community in my time as a history teacher. And I've got to be honest, beyond finding out about them themselves and a little bit about their lives in Carlisle, I never thought for 1 minute back in the 1990s to alter or adjust my history curriculum to make them feel seen and included. And probably shame on me when I think about it now. But times have changed, things have moved on, and I know that you three are going to explain to us a little bit about the community and tell us how and why we should aim to try to make a difference in the way that arguably I didn't. So Violet, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work and the community in Britain today.
Can I start by telling you off?
Of course.
It's communities.
Please do.
Communities. So within
communities, of course,
within the gypsy community alone, there's 3-4 different communities. So Gypsy Roma Tamil communities, it's huge. And it's just one of the things that I'm really keen to push, because people kind of think we're all one. Very separate, very different, very distinct.
So tell me about the different communities.
So yeah, I'm Violet. I have been working to try and make a change for my community and other communities since probably I was about 16, which is a long time now that I've been doing this. I'm now chairperson of an organisation called Moving for Change, which is a national organisation that supports roadside families. I'm also, as you said, CEO of York Travellers Trust, which for me was just like the pinnacle of what I've been reaching for. To be the boss of an organisation that supports my community and other communities was amazing for me. But I'm also a community researcher and different things like that. I've got so many hats. The term jack of all trades springs to mind quite a lot. But yeah, I guess I'm a bit of everything and anything. There's a book called Warning, Educated Gypsy. And I don't class myself as an educated gypsy. I left school quite young, but I'm a half educated gypsy, which is probably even more dangerous than a fully educated one. And the reason I'm here is just growing up, I didn't feel like school was part of me. You know, like I'm guessing quite a lot of kids, it's part of what they expect to see growing up, and they see themselves represented in the classroom when they're growing up. And I never felt like I was. I always felt very other and alien when I was in school. It's always bothered me a little bit. But now that I've got my own little girl who's only 4, I'm even more keen that we're there, that she has that chance to see herself and that she doesn't feel the need to mask. The Gypsy and Traveller communities, Gypsy Roma Traveller communities. So the term traveller is an umbrella term put in place by government that includes 3 ethnic minorities. So it's 3 communities that are recognised as separate and distinct ethnic minorities. And that's English Gypsy, which is what I am, Scottish Gypsy Traveller, and Travellers of Irish Heritage. So they're the 3 separate and distinct ethnic minorities under the term traveller. You then have new travellers and bargees, which are your lifestyle travellers. So those are people that are technically whatever culture they come from, and they adopt a lifestyle. And technically they stop being travellers when they stop travelling. But I would argue that if you're 4th-generation new traveller, then it's a bit more than living in a bus that makes you a new traveller. There's something more to that. But technically under law, you stop being a traveller when you stop travelling. And then you've got your economic travellers, which are your travelling show people, fairground travellers, and circus people. And again, technically, when they stop travelling, they're no longer deemed to be travellers. But I know these people incredibly well, and they have their own culture. They do have a language that is different. And I know people that have been settled down for 2 generations and still claim to be of that heritage. So it's a really hodgepodge of people. And then what government's tried to do is they've got this new group, Roma, that they've kind of gone, oh, where do we put them? Oh, let's just squeeze them in with this existing group, because the Roma are the distant cousins of the English Gypsy. So the Romani Chal people are the Roma, the Gypsy, and some of the Scottish Traveller people. So they've kind of tried to squeeze us all together into like this messy little parcel that doesn't make sense to anybody that's in the middle of the parcel. Like we're all in the middle of the parcel going, no, you don't belong here. You have different needs to me. But government in their infinite wisdom said, yes, these people are all the same. So yeah, it's a massive, huge array of people.
It's fascinating because it's news to many listeners. I imagine our listeners will have different starting points. And I was reading where, in fact, you mentioned the idea of ethnic minorities. The census actually kind of has made these distinct groups in 2011, I think I'm right in saying, for Gypsy travellers, and then in 2021 the Roma category has come into play as well.
We fought for them to be included, but actually Romani Gypsies has been recognised ethnicity since the 70s. Travellers of Irish Heritage have been a recognised ethnicity since 2000, 1999 included in the Race Relations Amendment Act of 2000. And then Scottish Gypsy Travellers have been recognised since 2008. So it's been a long history of recognition under British law. What we did, and quite a lot of other Gypsy Traveller organisations did, was argue that they should be included in the census, because how can we find the figures of the number of people in this country that identify as those ethnicities if we don't ask the question on the basic census? So we fought for that, and then we fought for it to be changed again. But it doesn't give an accurate picture. It doesn't give an accurate picture at all. And if you look at our past, which you can't look at because we don't know about it, but we mask, I mask, unless I absolutely have to not mask. And that's because of the history that we have, and because it's so easy for us to mask these days because of, we're fairly pale skin now, then we do mask. So you can't get a true idea of the figures. And particularly when the government can be less than friendly towards a group of people, they're not so keen to tick that gypsy traveller box. So the census is very flawed in its figures, but it does give us an idea of concentrations and where we use it more as a kind of a litmus test, I guess, like, oh, is the gypsies there, is there not gypsies there, rather than definitive numbers.
So I guess the numbers are underrepresented then, is what you're saying, if you were to take
Widely.
the official figures. So on that basis, what kind of numbers would you estimate that we're talking about, and where are the concentrations in the country?
So government estimates 300,000, which is round about 1 in 200. So for every 200 people, average, there'll be one gypsy traveller person. And if you think that a lot of us are masking, so a lot of us you won't see. I mean, if I choose to mask, then you don't go, oh, there's Violet, she's a gypsy. You don't. I just look like a white British person walking down the street. And that's true for most gypsies and travellers. As for concentrations, there's not like a central point that people want to be, but within England, Doncaster has one of the largest concentrations of gypsy travellers, which is just down the road from me. Darlington has a huge concentration outside of London, let's say that. Outside of London, the largest concentrations are Darlington and Doncaster. But usually it's big cities that have good access to the road network and, things like that. So places like York, where I work, you don't get a lot of through traffic, but you get people that have been there 5-6 generations that are gypsy travellers. So their needs are different to the big city gypsy travellers, shall we say. But generally big cities, good traffic, good road networks, good links, and easy access to the countryside is usually where you'll find a good number of people.
And again, feel free to tell me off and excuse my ignorance. But for instance, the young people that I taught in Carlisle, they lived kind of in a sort of settled Hadrian's camp community, which were sort of mobile, static caravans, and they were there and in and out of there. So their attendance at school was patchy. Is that your experience? Could you explain a little bit about day-to-day life as a gypsy today?
So well over 50% of the population is settled now. So like I live in a house. And in fact, I travelled more after I moved in a house. I moved more after I moved in a house than when I moved in a trailer. So I lived on my family's site prior to getting married. And I'd never moved for at least 10 years. My wheels had never turned on my trailer. And then we moved into a house when I got married 6 years ago. And we had 4 houses in the 6 years. It's just the idea of living in a house and not settling and not feeling right. It just doesn't feel... I hope this one does, because every penny we've got's in it. It's just finding that space, that it just doesn't... Yeah. So most gypsies and travellers, well over 50% and probably closer to 85% are settled down, either on permanent sites or in bricks and mortar like me. You've got around 15 to 20% recognised as being officially homeless. And sadly, that's your visible gypsies and travellers. That's the one that I get judged against. It's the one my little girl gets judged against. And when I deliver training, it's something I always say, like, you wouldn't want to be judged against your white British counterparts that are homeless. You wouldn't want to be judged against your Pakistani community members that are homeless. Don't judge me against the gypsy traveller population that's homeless. It's a very basic concept that we try and get across, because the really visible gypsies and travellers are officially homeless within this country, but it's a tiny number. So if you think there is 300,000, which there's way more than that, but if you think 300,000 and you say 20% are homeless, maths, come on, help people, teachers here. Is that like 60,000 that are homeless? So you're judging 300,000 people on the actions of 60,000, on the behaviours of 60,000, on the accepted way they live of 60,000. It's very, very unfair. But sadly, a lot of kids going into school have to get over that. So the vast majority are either, like you've said, on permanent sites. moving in and out. But I'll be honest, now it's so hard to actually travel that people very rarely move anywhere. They very rarely go anywhere other than like for funerals or big festivals, for want of a better word. So you'll get people moving out to the Christian conventions, the religious events. You'll get people moving out for Appleby. And if your family are horse people, then you might go in a wagon. So what could be a 3-day fair becomes a month because you're out in a horse and wagon. But yeah, I just think the vast majority are settled down. I think the issue with attendance at school is more about how people perceive education than about the physical locality of the people. When I deliver training, I try and explain like the general introduction that British society has had to education. So in the Industrial Revolution, the industrial age comes, kids are in factories working, they're picking the cotton from underneath the machines or whatever. And that was normal for them. And then somebody came along and went, oh, this isn't right. We need to give these kids an education. Let's take them out half a day a week. Okay, so these kids get taken out the factory in the Industrial Revolution, half a day a week to be taught. And over the centuries, that has built up gradually to full-time till you're 18. And the idea that you can get anywhere without that is quite limited within British society. You need an education to get anywhere in life. And that's the message that is accepted by most of British society. For us, my parents were asked not to come to school. My grandmother had to fight for my mother to get an education. My mother's in her 60s. They're not ancient, So my mother turns up at school. They say, no, we don't want you, you're a gypsy. Off you go. Okay? My grandmother, thankfully, was very strong and said, no, she wants an education. We're going to give her an education and you will accept her because every child's entitled to that. So she went for a few years, wherever they could, wherever they were stopping. But it was a fight each time. My father's parents weren't so keen on education, so they didn't put up the fight. When they said he couldn't come, they accepted that. My dad doesn't read. When I went to school, I had my hair checked every time I walked through the door. I was bullied relentlessly. I was made to feel inferior. I was made to feel, even though I was very clever, so I was sent to school being able to read and write. I was the prized pupil. The teachers thought I was amazing. I was made to feel very other, very strange, very weird. And when I left school at 9, nobody came looking for me. Nobody said, well, where's Violet? Where's she gone? Nobody, and we lived in a house at this point. We lived in a house and my mother worked for the education department. But nobody came looking for me. Nobody said, where's she gone? And we were just left. Thankfully, my mother wanted me to have an education, so she educated me at home. And my brother's older children, so my brother's older children are now late 20s. When they left school, nobody came looking for them. Nobody asked, where are they? Nobody wanted to know why they weren't in school. Now, this is after all the legislation that says you need to know where these kids are. These girls are in their 20s now. They're not, my age. And it's only my sister's younger girls and my brother's youngest girl. My brother's youngest girl is now 18. My sister's youngest girl is 12. Did anybody actually ask the question, why are they not in school? So for us, this idea that you must be in education, that is an intrinsic part of being British, isn't there. We don't have that history with it. And as a community, we have thrived without it. If you look at like my parents' generation, they were living in wagons, they earned enough money to get by, but that was it. They just kind of made their living to feed their children and feed themselves. You jump forward and we've got so many members of our communities now that have wealth, real wealth, and they've got that without educations. They've got that without bits of paper that prove who they are, that prove they're clever enough to do this job. And even me, like, I get asked all the time, like, oh, you must be a real advocate for education. I'm like, yeah, but not a forced education that doesn't suit the young person. Because I remember managing a youth worker and we was chatting about bits of paper. I said, oh, yeah, I always wanted to get a degree. It was my dream as a kid to get a bit of paper from a university and say, like, oh, there you go. I've got that now. I said, what do you mean? You don't have a degree? It's like, no, I've never been at university. I left when I was 13. Like, I left when I was 9 and went back when I was 12 for like 3 months. So no, I've just got here like by pure like blagging it, really. It's just like, what? So you mean you're my manager and you've never been to university? I said, well, I've done university courses that I've passed, but I've never been to university. So I've got thousands of pounds worth of university debt and you're my line manager. Yeah. And so until recently, we have blagged our way through society, and we have managed, we have managed to work the system, find out how it works, get our way through with what we need. But we now advocate that things are changing so drastically, things are becoming so difficult that you do need those bits of paper now. You do. You need those bits of paper. You need those things that quantify your knowledge. But it's not for the Gypsy and Traveller community, it's not I will get that bit of paper to validate myself. For Gypsies and Travellers, it's I'll get that bit of paper so I can do the job I know I can do.
Yeah, the resourcefulness that has been there anyway, down through the generations, is apparent. Great. Thanks very much, Violet, and thanks for sort of setting the scene there and painting the picture, because I just want to bring Helen in at this point. Helen, why then is it important for us, generally and as history teachers, to think about including Gypsy, Roma, Traveller communities, within our curriculum?
I almost don't know whether I need to say any more apart from, gosh, let's just pause and hear what we've heard Violet say. And I've heard Violet speak before, and she always just blows me away, because I realise just how little we're doing. But of course it's important. And let's focus now into the history side of things, because what we can't do in the whole podcast is look at the whole of the education system. But the bottom line is, as our wonderful friend and colleague Claire Hollis always says, that we've got to represent everybody in the history classroom. And as I think it was it Christine Counsell who said, the curriculum has got to whisper to every child, you belong. And I'm so struck by what Violet is saying about what that means for the individual and what it means to actually be listened to as a human being. But also, we're not representing history as history teachers well enough unless we are teaching a history which is as glorious in its technical as human pasts were. Of course, we're only ever teaching interpretations of the past, but it's beholden on us to be as representative of the complexity of the past and the glorious messiness of human history as we possibly can be. So yeah, I mean, those are the curricular reasons, but none of them is quite as important as what Violet has just said.
And Violet touched upon the history, as she said, well, kind of not being there. And I suppose what Violet means is maybe not written down in the same to the same extent as other groups. So oral tradition, I'm assuming, is probably a big part of the Gypsy community. So with that said, with maybe there being less scholarship or less written documents and so on, how, Helen, do you think, or maybe even Violet, either of you, how do you think teachers can go about incorporating the Gypsy, Roma, Traveller communities' stories into their history teaching?
Yes, we actually have to acknowledge this, that say, for example, unlike if we're saying we ought to be teaching more Black and British history, there is less of what we would call historiography out there. There are less books that history teachers can pop into Waterstones and pick up and buy and learn. We certainly don't have, apart from the one, thank you Hodder Education for trying, we don't yet have the textbooks that people can pick up in busy lives hurriedly and find out stuff. So yes, we do have to work harder. Actually, historians will tell you that they have to work differently from the traditional. So the written record is not necessarily there. Or if it's there, then it's, as with many marginalised or people who have been not in the mainstream of society, it's when people bump up against the criminal justice system or bump up against other aspects of control. And so therefore it's a very, very partial perspective and not usually people's voices. But we've been incredibly fortunate because while it is fair to say that sort of, if you like, stream of history for a history teacher to quickly plug into isn't as rich, it's growing and it's growing all the time. there are people like, huge shout out for Professor Becky Taylor at UEA, who does so much fantastic work, and Rich and I have worked with her hugely in terms of her sharing. She goes fossicking through the archives and reading against the grain and using all her historian skills. But we're also getting better at listening in other ways. I'm going to give a shout out to Violet, which is why I wanted to leap in first, because one of the first things that Rich and I used was her fabulous Proud Gypsy Traveller site, and the work that you've done in Doncaster. And that's how Rich and I first came along across Jack Cunningham, VC, from the Somme, member of the Gypsy Traveller communities, who is an ideal person that you can weave into curriculum, and perhaps we'll sort of come back to that. Becky always talks about looking at song, looking at places. Why is somewhere called Gypsy Lane? What can we draw attention to that? Let's go local. Actually, it's beholden us as teachers to listen to people like Violet. I'm so lucky in York because we've got people like Violet. But wherever you are, there will be people who are the holders of the knowledge, the people who know, the people who, if you just ask, can say, this is where we are in the communities, and this is what's valuable to us. And that's so important. So I'll now shut up and let Violet jump in and tell us where the sources are.
Well, sure I can. No, there are lots. I think the problem with history is, for want of a better word, it has been whitewashed, and it has been kind of, a narrative has been created. There are documents out there. There's lots of documents. When is it Ian Kendrick went looking for stuff on the Holocaust, he found all this stuff in Nazi Germany that had just been kind of hidden and pushed aside and disregarded because it mentioned the Roma. There's swathes of information out there. It's just kind of putting it into the mainstream, I think. I think we probably don't have the same amount of information because the Holocaust, the Gypsy Holocaust, wasn't even recognised until 1979. So it's quite late in coming to the into this sort of the group. But I think there's so much other that we could talk about. There's so many other points of history that need to be explored. I've just recently realised, I mean, this is shocking in my 40s that I'm coming here, that I'm probably Scottish traveller descent more than English Romani child because of the language I speak. What I didn't know is of the Tinker experiment. The Tinker experiment in Scotland started in the 1950s and lasted till the 1980s. And there's books out there called Canada's Little Slave Girls and things like that. I think that's what it's called, Canada's Little Slave Girls or Canada's Little Slave Children. And Scotland was breeding the gypsy out of the people there, same as they were doing in the Aborigines in Australia. So they were taking children from their parents, putting them in these institutions where they would be anglicised, I guess, and then sending them away to adoptive parents in places like Canada and wherever else. So my family left Scotland around that time to avoid that. That's all there. The documents are all there. The information is all there. But the sad thing is that nobody of Scottish traveller lineage has received an apology. Nobody said, we're sorry we did this, because the Scottish government's going, it wasn't us, we're a new government. It was the English. The English government are going, no, it happened in Scotland. It's not us. So nobody's accepting it. Nobody's acknowledging it. Nobody's saying if we'd have managed to get away with it in Scotland, we'd have done it in England as well. You know, there's none of those conversations happening because it's easy just kind of, it's a bit unpleasant, isn't it? And it's 1980s. Like, this is quite new. Like, let's just pretend that's not happening. So I think there's a lot of that that's happened over in history. And I mean, like, there's no recognition that our language is intrinsic in the English language. I've done really quick looks, and apparently the word bungalow is a Romani child word, the word lollipop, dad. All these words that we just use every day, and modern words like chav and kushti and paga and all those kind of slangy words, as people call them, they're Romani child words. They're not slang. They're Romani child words that have been appropriated and used. And I just think that, sorry, I've gone off on one. I've gone off on a complete rant because I just can't believe that as a woman in my 40s, I'm revisiting stuff that I was told in school. I'm revisiting conversations that I've had with teachers where either from ignorance or racism, they've given me and a classroom of my peers complete misinformation about who I am.
I think we could have a podcast in its entirety about the Tinker experiment, which I'd never heard of. But I think, well, it's so shocking. And the 1980s was last week in my head. So, and the thing is, Helen mentioned Jack Cunningham, VC. I think it's important as well to not have a deficit model when it comes to looking at minority groups and kind of telling tragic, sad stories, the whole, Holocaust, all the rest. Of course, all of that plays a part, but also looking at positive stories and highlights. And maybe, Helen, you spoke about, you've written about, I should say, in your article with Rich, about a slotting in model and weaving in, for instance, Jack Cunningham's story. Could you tell us a little bit more about that, maybe, Helen?
I think you're picking up what Violet's saying. It is this balance, isn't it? Because I'm very aware, and I would sort of say very aware, Violet, if I've got a child in my class and then the only history I tell is this very difficult history, that's really quite traumatic. So we do need a balance, don't we? So actually, just before I talk about Jack Cunningham, I'll talk about a little bit of work we've done recently to try and encourage colleagues who are teaching about the Romani genocide as part of perhaps GCSE National Socialist Germany topics, to actually say, in the same way as we would now say it's much better practice to talk about Jewish life before the Holocaust, talk about Romani life in Europe before the Holocaust. So we've put together a very small resource which is now out there and freely available to say, look, these are who these people were. Obviously, it's very small. It's a flavour because we realistically know people are going to maybe have about 20 minutes to teach this. But at least it's saying, hang on, these are, before we actually start exterminating people you've got no connection with, can we please identify with these people as human beings and look at the contribution they were making to their society? Because I think one of the things I've become quite passionate about here is that this is not just Gypsy Roma traveller history. This is British history. This is European history. This is part of all of us. And exactly as Violet was saying there, with the language is infused through it. So back to Jack Cunningham, because we're all going off, we're all being bad people and going off on one, and Carmel's trying to keep us in order. But Jack Cunningham is absolutely this. Jack's a man from Hull. Jack's a human being, and if you read his full story, he's a human being with all the glories and all the difficulties of a human being. And Jack Cunningham is caught up in that hugely tragic event of his generation called World War I, and goes off to serve his country. And one of the things that we sort of haven't said yet, but was sort of there in what Violet was saying earlier, is that actually if you go looking for the records, probably nobody made a note that Jack Cunningham was a Gypsy traveller. He was signed up because we didn't. So when people say things like, oh, well, my grandfather used to say the Gypsies didn't fight in the war or whatever, we have no idea about that. That's just pure prejudice because nobody was making a note of that. As we've said, nobody was making a note of who people were. But Jack Cunningham, we know, is a Gypsy and traveller with a lot of connection to the whole area. And he was fighting in the middle of the Somme battle and did heroic deeds and won the VC and survived. And there's actually film footage of Jack as well in his uniform, sitting in some R&R time, which is lovely, sharing some sweets with some children. But you can use Jack's story in so many ways, perhaps to personalise this huge thing called the Battle of the Somme, which can just become numbers and statistics. You can use his story and where he was fighting around, I believe it's the Sayre Road, and I should have looked that up more before I came on. Thanks, I'm getting the thumbs up from Rich here. Because he's in the autumn, so we can get away from that everything about the Somme is the 1st of July thing. Loads of teachers are taking their kids off on battlefields tours. You could actually be in the location, because it's Sayre Road, where Jack did his deeds and tell his story. Yes, Jack is a Gypsy traveller heritage, but actually, yes, he's also part of humanising this big story called the First World War, which we still tell to all our British school children. And so that's what we'd mean by the idea of slotting in. I think if you do that, it's doing wonderful things. It's not saying, right, stop everything. We're now going to have 4 lessons about Gypsy Roma travellers. Because, yes, sometimes we do want to completely foreground stories, but we also want to make sure that all our students feel as though this is part of the warp and weft of British life. Does that make sense, Carmen?
Absolutely. Well said. It really, really does. And I'm just looking here in the Teaching History magazine. You've got a wonderful still footage of Jack Cunningham sharing the sweets, as you mentioned. And that would be such a wonderful lesson starter on page 16 of that Teaching History edition, the article that you wrote with Rich. Thank you, Helen. Now, Rich, let's keep it personal. Tell us about the part you've played in this, and keeping it personal, the story of Mary Squires.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm just really riding on the coattails of Violet and Helen. So, but Helen started off wanting to do something a little bit more than Jack Cunningham, and sort of roped me in. And we started by reading a history of gypsies written by David Cressy. We were looking for a story, and we were looking for an area where we could perhaps write some lessons. And I think we both got to the story of Mary Squires more or less at the same point in our reading, because there was a flurry of WhatsApp messages about, I think I've got a story. It's, yeah, I think I have too. Is it Mary Squires? It is Mary Squires. We can do something with this. So as we read, and David Cressy, to his credit, gives quite a large chunk of that chapter on Mary Squires. It's one of the biggest pieces in the book on a single person, really. And so we thought, yeah, here's somebody that we can shape some lessons around, with the idea being that she was around in the sort of mid to late 18th century, at a time when we started to reflect on our history teaching, thinking that perhaps our 1750 to 1900 period teaching, wasn't the best part, wasn't for me, certainly wasn't the most enjoyable part of the Key Stage 3 curriculum that I taught. And maybe we could do something in here with Mary Squires' story. We did have at one point an image where we would have sort of Mary Squires standing in 1750 waving at Jack Cunningham in 1914. And we would start to look at the continuities and changes in their lives. Can you remember that? So that's that. And again, when we talk to university students about this and about the process of designing lessons around something, you have to have lots and lots. Well, you don't have to, but we had ideas, and then you just discount those ideas when better ones take their place. And in the end, we did settle on a really not easy question, but on a really straightforward question: how much did gypsy and traveller life change in Britain? And we stuck with those dates, actually, with Mary Squires' dates of 1753 and the beginning of the First World War, 1914. We could easily have gone from 1750 to 1900, but we just thought we'd make it a little bit more personal by just making it a little bit messier at each end. And look at the social and economic changes in Britain in that period, things that are commonly taught in British schools, but we thought we would be able to bring in this through the lens of the gypsy and traveller past, and so give it a different sort of angle to the thing that we thought most teachers would do. So I'm not going to be able to go into a huge amount of detail on Mary Squires' story, just to say that she was falsely accused and tried, and then condemned to death for abduction in 1753. And it is a really, really interesting story. She does have a book written. There is a book written about this. What I find fascinating about this book, it's not got Mary Squires in the title at all. It's got the name of the person that she abducted in the title. Now, the book was written, I think it was either in the 70s or the 80s, but it's called The Canning Enigma, and she was tried and condemned to death for abducting Elizabeth Canning. And luckily, there was a magistrate in London who sort of started doing a little bit of digging, because he had personal animosity with Henry Fielding, who was the prosecuting magistrate, and thought, well, if he's the prosecutor, then I'm going to be the defender, sort of thing, and found out that she could not have abducted this person because she was not anywhere near London at the time this person was abducted. So then we could look at Mary's life and her journey from the South Coast to London in the time of the abduction, and just sort of unravel and unwrap her story for students to delve into. Deliberately, as Helen mentioned earlier, not saying we're now going to study 3 or 4 lessons on Gypsy Roma Traveller, let's do this. We started with Mary's story so that any preconceptions of this particular group were left and weren't brought into the classroom, and then we sort of introduced in that way. And then we used, I think, what we felt were just sort of good history teaching skills to include what could happen and what was happening to the Gypsy Roma traveller community in that period, and how things that changed and impacted British society also changed and impacted the Gypsy community, and then looking at the extent of that change. Was it a positive or negative change? Did it cause big changes? Did it cause little changes, and so on and so forth? So trying to consider those sorts of things. We tried to bring in the role of fairs as well, and to think about how they changed over time. But we basically picked up on 6 key areas: travel, freedom, the freedom to live, urbanisation, jobs, education, and fairs. So that sort of chimes with what Violet was saying earlier as well, and how things that had this little impact for British society, tarmacking roads, for instance. Not that that's a little impact at all, sorry, but tarmacking roads, the impact that would have on British society, the speeding up of the movement of goods, etc., etc. Is that a positive or negative impact on a Gypsy community? And if so, why? And we used to finish off with a sort of a tried and tested and much loved activity from Ian Dawson on changing continuity in the Norman period, and just changed it for this particular course.
So I guess teachers would be, maybe Thomas Telford, John McAdam. These might be part of what they're teaching about anyway. So you're just looking, you're not creating any extra work in a crowded curriculum as such. These resources are available on the HA website and the Euroclear website. Is that right? If teachers would like to have a go?
That's exactly right. I mean, exactly what you said there, Carmel. We didn't want to create... There is more work here because you're including a group that you probably haven't already included in your teaching. So there is a bit more work. However, the general gist of what we were doing, I think, is something that was taught in schools quite commonly, those sorts of things. And therefore, we could get this in on the back of that, I think. But yes, it's on HA website, and it's on your Clio website, Helen, isn't it? Yeah. Thumbs up for Helen on that.
Great. Perfect. So if teachers have been inspired by this conversation and they'd like to have a go and have a try, and your article is a real call to arms, encouraging people not to just do nothing, but to at least try, to acknowledge, to include, then hopefully they've been given some food for thought this afternoon. And we, with the show notes, can point people in the direction of community awareness raising. So Violet, they can follow some of the things that you've mentioned about what life is like and where Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities live within the country. And beyond that, the links to history teaching resources as well. Great. Okay. Wow. What a fascinating conversation. I could chat to you guys all afternoon, honestly. Sadly, we're virtually out of time. So it just leaves for me to thank you all. Are there any closing comments or kind of final pointers that I've missed? If so, shout up now.
I'm just really interested in knowing, but I'd love to know. You probably can't find this out because when you said tarmac and stuff like that, my immediate thing is, oh yeah, because we earned lots of money from that. And it was only my second thought that went, oh yeah, the horses. We had to stop using the horses, which is why I settled in Yorkshire. Well, my grandparents settled in Yorkshire because they had to stop using horses. So I would love to know how many people go from, oh, but they earn lots of money from tarmac, to, oh, actually, it did X, Y, and Z. It'd be really interesting. And I just love the idea that you're doing that. I didn't know you were doing that. Because when I was at school, I remember being in the classroom, being taught history and going, Miss, where's the gypsies? Where's the gypsies? Because I'm a big mouth, in case you hadn't worked out. And she was like, oh, they weren't there. So with the war stuff, we weren't there because that's where we came from. We all ran away and that's who gypsies are. So that was that one. But then when we was learning about the time period you said, I can't remember what it's 1700s to early 1800s. I was like, Miss, is there anywhere I can read about gypsies of this time period? And she was like, no. And I ended up writing my own little mini story to fit in with my assignment, so I could be there in my own assignment type thing. So I absolutely love that idea that we're just gradually chucking in the conversation, And it's what we say about Gypsy Traveller History Month. Don't just celebrate it because you've got a gypsy kid in the classroom. Celebrate it because you've got a gypsy kid in the country. Other people need to know about other people in a positive light, not just all the misery that we hear.
I think the Industrial Revolution as well, the economic history side of things is where, the gypsy story can come in, because as you alluded to before, Violet, being resourceful, making a living in different ways, working out how to create wealth without formal education necessarily. I think economic history is a strand where the gypsy Roma traveller communities can be represented. Rich or Helen, anything else you'd like to say?
Listening to your last podcast with Claire and Becky, and Claire used the phrase, and she used it in her teaching history article, routine representation. And that's exactly what we're doing here again, isn't it? Weaving in underrepresented groups and themes in a meaningful and not tokenistic way. And that's what we're trying to, that's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah. And I would just add to that, it can seem daunting when you're incredibly busy, but just lean in. Don't be avoidant. These stories are there. They are to be uncovered. Just because they haven't yet been doesn't mean they're not there. And if we all work together, in the course of the last couple of years, we've put lots of stuff out there in terms of, hey, there's this history story, there's that history story. So we've got from Jack Cunningham to Mary Squires to more information about the Belvedere Marshes and the way people were feeding London, almost literally, by their sort of hop picking work in Kent and their harvesting in Kent. We can do this, but we can do it together.
Absolutely. And you guys have gone to the bother of, you modestly describe yourself as not being pioneers in the article, but what you have pioneered is some ready-made lessons based on, tried and tested ideas like tabards, Ian Dawson, we know it works. I've seen you guys, showcasing this at the Historical Association conference, and it was absolutely brilliant, and everybody there bought into it, and we loved playing a part in it. So teachers can reinvigorate and enthuse their curriculums with these materials. Thank you all so much. I'm looking forward to people reacting to this episode, and maybe if they develop things, we can pass that information on. It can feature in the One Big History Department blog. This is all about, generating ideas. You mentioned local approaches, Helen, and Gypsy Lane and so on. I'm sure that teachers will be enthused to find out what's happening or what has happened in their local communities as well. And, young people like Violet might be writing their own histories, as you did, Violet, today as well and going forward, which is a wonderful legacy if that's what happens. Thank you all so much for being my guest this afternoon on the Reteach History podcast, and all the best with everything you've got going on as well.